is there any concerns that the export controls push China to take military action on Taiwan?
This is the big risk, right? The further you push China away from having access to cutting edge American and global technologies, the more likely they are to say, well, because I can't access it, I might as well, like, no one should access it, right? And there's a few like interesting aspects of that, right? Like, China has a urban rural divide like no other. They have a male female birth ratio like no other, to the point where, if you look in most of China, it's like the ratio is not that bad, but when you look at single dudes in rural China, it's like a 30-to-1 ratio.
Hmm.
And those are disenfranchised dudes, right? Like, quote unquote, like the US has an incel problem, like China does too. It's just they're placated in some way or crushed down. What do you do with these people? And at the same time, you're not allowed to access the most important technology. At least the US thinks so. China's maybe starting to think this is the most important technology by starting to dump subsidies in it, right? They thought EVs and renewables were the most important technology. They dominate that now, right? Now they started thinking about that about semiconductors in, the late 2010s and early 2020s. And now they've been dumping money and they're catching up rapidly. And they're going to do the same with AI, right? Because they're very talented, right? The question is like, when does this hit a breaking point, right? And if China sees this as, hey, they can continue, if not having access and starting a true hot war, right, taking over Taiwan or trying to subvert its democracy in some way or blockading it, hurts the rest of the world far more than it hurts them, this is something they could potentially do, right? And so is this pushing them towards that? Potentially, right? I'm not quite a geopolitical person, but it's obvious that the world regime of peace and like trade is like super awesome for economics. But at some point it could break, right?
I think we should comment that why Chinese economy would be hurt by that is that they're export heavy. I think the United States buys so much, like if that goes away, like that's how their economy.
Well, also they just like would not be able to import raw materials from like all over the world, right?
Mhm.
The US would just shut down the Strait of Malacca, and like, at the same time the US like, you could argue almost all the GDP growth in America since, the 70s has been either population growth or tech, right? Because, your life today is not that much better than someone from the 80s outside of tech, right? You still, cars, they all have semiconductors in them everywhere. Fridges, semiconductors everywhere. There's these funny stories about how Russians were taking apart laundry machines because they had certain like Texas Instrument chips that they could then repurpose and put into like their anti-missile things, right? Like their S-400 or whatever. You would know more about this, but there's all sorts of like everything about semiconductors is so integral to every part of our lives.
So can you explain the role of TSMC in the story of semiconductors, and maybe also how the United States can break the reliance on TSMC?
I don't think it's necessarily breaking the reliance. I think it's getting TSMC to build in the U.S. But taking a step back, right? TSMC produces most of the world's chips, right? Especially on the foundry side. There's a lot of companies that build their own chips. Samsung, Intel, ST Micro, Texas Instruments, Analog Devices, all these kinds of companies build their own chips, NXP, but more and more of these companies are outsourcing to TSMC and have been for multiple decades.
Can you explain the supply chain there and where most of TSMC is in terms of manufacturing?
Sure. So historically, supply chain was companies would build their own chips. They would, it'd be a company started, they'd build their own chips, and then they'd design the chip and build the chip and sell it. Over time, this became really difficult because the cost of building a fab continues to compound every single generation. Of course, figuring out the technology for it is incredibly difficult regardless, but just the dollars and cents that are required, ignoring, saying, hey, yes, I have all the technical capability, which it's really hard to get that, by the way, right? Intel's failing, Samsung's failing, etc. But if you look at just the dollars to spend to build that next generation fab, it keeps growing, right? Sort of like, Moore's law is halving the cost of chips every 2 years. There's a separate law that's sort of like doubling the cost of fabs every handful of years. And so you look at a leading edge fab that is going to be profitable today, that's building, 3 nanometer chips or 2 nanometer chips in the future, that's going to cost north of $30-40 billion, right? And that's just for like a token amount. That's for that's like the base building block. And you probably need to build multiple, right? And so when you look at the industry over the last, if I go back 20, 30 years ago, there were 20, 30 companies that could build the most advanced chips, and then they would design them themselves and sell them, right? So companies like AMD would build their own chips. Intel, of course, still builds their own chips. They're very famous for it, but IBM would build their own chips. And, you could keep going down the list. All these companies built their own chips. Slowly, they kept falling like flies. And that's because of what TSMC did, right? They created the Foundry business model, which is, I'm not going to design any chips. I'm just going to contract manufacture chips for other people. And one of their early customers is NVIDIA, right? NVIDIA is the only semiconductor company that's worth, that's doing more than $1 billion of revenue that was started in the era of Foundry, right? Every other company started before then and at some point had fabs, which is actually incredible, right? Like AMD and Intel and Broadcom.
Such a
through
great
the history.
fact.
It's like everyone had fabs at some point, or some companies like Broadcom, it was like a merger, amalgamation of various companies that rolled up. But even today, Broadcom has fabs, right? They build iPhone RF radio chips sort of in Colorado for Apple, right? Like there's all these companies had fabs, and for most of the fabs, they threw them away or sold them off, or they got rolled into something else. And now everyone relies on TSMC, right? Including Intel. Their latest PC chip uses TSMC chips, right? It also uses some Intel chips, but it uses TSMC process.
Can you explain why the foundry model is so successful for these companies? Why are they going with
Economies of scale?
Yeah, so I mean, like I mentioned, right? The cost of building a fab is so high. The R&D is so difficult, and when you look at like these like companies that had their own vertical stack, there was an antiquated process of like, okay, like I'm so hyper customized to each specific chip, right? But as we've gone through the history of sort of like the last 50 years of electronics and semiconductors, you need more and more specialization, right? Because Moore's law has died. Dennard scaling has died, i.e. chips are not getting better just for free, right? From manufacturing, you have to make real architectural innovations, right? Google is not just running on Intel CPUs for web serving. They have a YouTube chip, they have TPUs, they have Pixel chips, they have a wide diversity of chips that, generate all the economic value of Google, right? It's running all the services and stuff. And this is just Google, and you could go across any company in the industry, and it's like this, right? Cars contain 5,000 chips, 200 different varieties of them, right? All these random things. A Tesla door handle has 2 chips, right? Like it's like ridiculous. And it's a cool door handle, right? It's like, you don't think about it, but it's like has 2 really chipped like penny like chips in there, right? Anyway, so as you have more diversity of chips, as you have more specialization required, and the cost of fabs continues to grow, you need someone who is laser focused on building the best process technology and making it as flexible as possible.
I think you could say it simply, which is the cost per fab goes up. And if you are a small player that makes a few types of chips, you're not going to have the demand to pay back the cost of the fab. Whereas NVIDIA can have many different customers and aggregate all this demand into one place. And then they're the only person that makes enough money building chips to build the next fab. So this is kind of why the companies slowly get killed, because they have 10 years ago a chip that is profitable and is good enough, but the cost to build the next one goes up. They may try to do this, fail because they don't have the money to make it work, and then they don't have any chips, or they build it and it's too expensive and they just have
or they
not
run
profitable
there's
chips.
more failure points, right? You could have one little process related to like some sort of like chemical etch, or some sort of like plasma etch, or some little process that screws up. You didn't engineer it right, and now the whole company falls apart. You can't make chips, right? And so super, super powerful companies like Intel, they had like the weathering storm to like, hey, they still exist today, even though they really screwed up their manufacturing 6-7 years ago. But in the case of like AMD, they almost went bankrupt. They had to sell their fabs to Mubadala, UAE, right? And like that became a separate company called Global Foundries, which is a foundry firm. And then AMD was able to then focus on the return back up, was like, hey, let's focus on making chiplets and a bunch of different chips for different markets, and focusing on specific workloads rather than all of these different things. And so you get more diversity of chips. You have more companies than ever designing chips, but you have fewer companies than ever manufacturing them, right? And this is where TSMC comes in, is they've just been the best, right? They are so good at it, right? They're customer focused. They make it easy for you to fabricate your chips. They take all of that complexity and like kind of try and abstract a lot of it away from you. They make good money. They don't make insane money, but they make good money. And they're able to aggregate all this demand and continue to build the next fab, the next fab, the next fab.
So why is Taiwan so special for TSMC? Why is it happening there? Can it be replicated inside the United States?
Yeah, so there's aspects of it that I would say yes, and aspects that I'd say no, right? TSMC is way ahead because former executive Morris Chang of Texas Instruments wasn't promoted to CEO, and he's like, screw this, I'm going to go make my own chip company, right? And he went to Taiwan and made TSMC, right? And there's a whole lot more story there. So it could have been Texas Instruments, could have been could have been TSMC, but Texas Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, right? Instead of Texas Instruments, right? But so there is that whole story there. But the
sitting here in Texas,
I mean, and that sounds like a human story. Like he didn't get promoted.
Just the brilliance of Morris Chang, which I wouldn't underplay. But there's also like a different level of like how this works, right? So in Taiwan, the top percent of graduates of students that go to the best school, which is NTU, the top percent of those all go work to TSMC, right? And guess what their pay is? Their starting pay is like $80,000, $70,000, right? Which is like, that's like starting pay for like a good graduate in the US, right? Not the top. The top graduates are making hundreds of thousands of dollars at the Googles and the Amazons, and now I guess the OpenAIs of the world, right? So there is a large dichotomy of like, what is the top 1% of the society doing, and where are they headed because of economic reasons, right? Intel never paid that crazy good, right? And it didn't make sense to them, right? That's one aspect, right? Where is the best going? Second is the work ethic, right? Like, we like to work, you work a lot, we work a lot, but at the end of the day, when there's what is the time and amount of work that you're doing, and what does a fab require, right? Fabs are not work from home jobs. You go into the fab and grueling work, right? There's hey, if there is any amount of vibration, right? An earthquake happens, vibrates the machines. They're all, they're either broken, you've scrapped some of your production, and then in many cases they're like not calibrated properly. So when there's an earthquake, right? Recently there's been an earthquake. TSMC doesn't call their employees. They just go to the fab, and like they just show up, the parking lot gets slammed, and people just go into the fab and fix it, right? Like it's like it's like ants, right? Like it's like, a hive of ants doesn't get told by the queen what to do. The ants just know.
It's like one person just specializes on these one task. And it's like, you're going to take this one tool and you're the best person in the world. And this is what you're going to do for your whole life, is this one task in the fab.
Which is like some special chemistry plus nano manufacturing on one line of tools that continues to get iterated. And yeah, it's like specific plasma etch for removing silicon dioxide, right? That's all you focus on your whole career. And it's like such a specialized thing. And so it's not like the tasks are transferable. AI today is awesome because like people can pick it up like that. Semiconductor manufacturing is very antiquated and difficult. None of the materials are online for people to read easily and learn, right? The papers are very dense, and like it takes a lot of experience to learn. And so it makes the barrier to entry much higher too. So when you talk about, hey, you have all these people that are super specialized, they will work, 80 hours a week in a factory, right? In a fab. And if anything goes wrong, they'll go show up in the middle of the night because some earthquake. Their wife's like, there was an earthquake. He's like, great, I'm gonna go to the fab. It's
time
like,
to grind.
Would you like, as an American, do that, right? It's like these sorts of things are like what, I guess are the exemplifying like why TSMC is so amazing. Now, can you replicate it in the US? Let's not ignore Intel was the leader in manufacturing for over 20 years. They brought every technology to market first, besides EUV, strained silicon, high-K metal gates, FinFET, and the list goes on and on and on of technologies that Intel brought to market first, made the most money from, and manufactured at scale first, best, highest profit margins, right? So we shouldn't ignore that Intel can't do this, right? It's that the culture has broken, right? You've invested in the wrong things. They said no to the iPhone. They had all these different things regarding like, mismanagement of the fabs, mismanagement of designs, this lockup, right? And at the same time, all these brilliant people, right? These like 50,000 PhDs, or masters that have been working on specific chemical or physical processes or nano manufacturing processes for decades in Oregon. They're still there. They're still producing amazing work. It's just like getting it to the last mile of production at high yield, where you can where you can manufacture dozens and hundreds of different kinds of chips. And it's good customer experience has broken, right? It's that customer experience. It's like part of it is like people will say Intel was too pompous in the 2010s, right? They just thought they were better than everyone. The tool guys were like, oh, I don't think that this is mature enough. And they're like, you just don't know. We know, right? This sort of stuff would happen. And so can the US bring it to the, can the US bring leading edge semiconductor manufacturing to the US? Emphatically, yes, right? And we are, right?
It's happening. Arizona is getting better and better as time goes on.
TSMC has built, roughly 20% of their capacity for 5 nanometer in the US, right? Now, this is nowhere near enough, right? 20% of capacity in the US is like nothing, right? And furthermore, this is still dependent on Taiwan existing, right? There's sort of important way to separate it out. There's R&D and there's high volume manufacturing. There are 3 places in the world that are doing leading edge R&D. There's Hsinchu, Taiwan, there's Hillsboro, Oregon, and there is Pyongyang, South Korea, right? These 3 places are doing the leading edge R&D for the rest of the world's leading edge semiconductors, right? Now, manufacturing can be distributed more globally, right? And this is sort of where this dichotomy exists of like who's actually modifying the process, who's actually developing the next generation one, who's improving them, is Hsinchu, is Hillsboro, is Pyongyang, right? It is not the rest of these fabs like Arizona, right? Arizona is a paperweight. If Hsinchu disappeared off the face of the planet, within a year, couple years, Arizona would stop producing too, right? It's actually like pretty critical. One of the things I like to say is if I had like a few missiles, I know exactly where I could cause the most economic damage, right? It's not targeting the White House, right?
It's the
not
R&D centers.
It's the R&D centers for TSMC, Intel, Samsung, and then some of the memory guys, Micron and Hynix.
Because they define the future evolution of these semiconductors, and everything's moving so rapidly that it really is fundamentally about R&D. And it is all about TSMC. Huh.
And so TSMC, you cannot purchase a vehicle without TSMC chips, right? You cannot purchase a fridge without TSMC chips. You cannot, I think one of the few things you can purchase, ironically, is a Texas Instruments like graphing calculator, right? Because they actually manufacture in Texas. But like outside of that, like a laptop, a phone,
depressing.
anything servers, right? GPUs, none of this stuff can exist. And this is without TSMC. And in many cases, it's not even like the leading edge, sexy 5 nanometer chip, 3 nanometer chip, 2 nanometer chip. Oftentimes it's just like some stupid power IC that's like converting from like, some voltage to another, right? And it's made at TSMC, right?
This
it's
is
like
what China is investing in as well. It's like they can build out this long tail fab where the techniques are much more known. You don't have to figure out these problems with EUV. They're investing in this, and then they have large supply for things like the car door handles and the random stuff. And that trickles down into this whole economic discussion as well, which is they have far more than we do. And having supply for things like this is crucial to normal life.
So they're starting to invest in high volume manufacture, but they're not doing R&D.
So they do R&D on their own. They're just way behind, right? Yeah. So I would say like in 2015, China had a 5-year plan where they defined by 2025 and 2020 certain goals, including like 80% domestic production of semiconductors. They're not going to hit that, right? To be clear, but they are in certain areas really, really close, right? Like BYD is probably going to be the first company in the world to not have to use TSMC for making, because they have their own fabs, right? For making chips. Now they still have to buy some chips from foreign, for example, like around like self-driving ADAS capabilities, because those are really high end. But at least like like an internal combustion engine has 40 chips in an EV, just for like controlling like flow rates and all these things. And EVs are even more complicated. So all these different power ICs and battery management controllers and all these things, they're insourcing, right? And this is something that like China has been doing since 2015. Now, as far as like the trailing edge, they're getting so much capacity there. As far as the leading edge, right, i.e. this 5 nanometer and so on and so forth, right, where GPUs, they are still behind. And this is the US restrictions are trying to stop them in the latter. But, all that's happened, is yes, they've slowed down their 5 nanometer, 3 nanometer, et cetera, but they've accelerated their, 45 nanometer, 90 nanometer power IC or analog IC or, random chip in my keyboard, right? That kind of stuff. So there is an angle of like, the US's actions have been so, from these export, from the angle of the export controls, have been so inflammatory at slowing down China's progress on the leading edge that they've turned around and have accelerated their progress elsewhere because they know this is so important, right? If the US is going to lock them out here, what if they lock us out here as well in the trailing edge? And so going back, can the US build it here? Yes, but it's going to take a ton of money. I truly think like to revolutionize and completely insource semiconductors would take a decade and $1 trillion.
Is some of it also culture? Like you said, extreme competence, extreme work ethic in Taiwan.
I think if you have the demand and the money is on the line, the American companies figure it out. going to take handholding with the government, but I think that the culture helps TSMC break through, and it's easier for them. It's like
TSMC has something like 90,000 employees, right? It's not actually that insane an amount. The Arizona fab has 3,000 from Taiwan. And these people, like, their wives were like, yeah, we're not going to have kids unless you sign up for the Arizona fab. We go to Arizona and we have our kids there. There's also a Japan fab where the same thing happened, right? And so, like, these wives drove like these dudes to like go to Japan or America to have the kids there. And it's like it's an element of culture. Yeah, sure. Taiwan works that hard, but also, like, the US has done it in the past. They could do it now, right? We can just import the best people in the world if we want to.
That's where the immigration conversation is a tricky one, and there's been a lot of debate over that. But yeah, it seems absurdly controversial to import the best people in the world. I don't understand why it's controversial. That's one of the ways of winning.
Sure, we agree with you.
And like, even if you can't import those people, I still think you could do a lot to manufacture most of it in the US if the money's there, right?
Yeah.
And so,
it's
like,
just way more expensive. It's not profitable for a long time.
And that's the context of, like, the CHIPS Act is only like $50 billion relative to, some of the renewable, initiatives that were passed in the Inflation Reduction Act and the Infrastructure Act, which total in the hundreds of billions of dollars, right? And so, like, the amount of money that the U.S. is spending on the semiconductor industry is nothing, right? Whereas all these other countries have structural advantages in terms of, like, work ethic and amount of work and, like, things like that, but also a number of STEM graduates, the percentile of their best going to that, right? But they also have, like, differences in terms of, like, hey, there's just tax benefits in the law and have been in the law for 20 years, right? And then some countries have massive subsidies, right? China has something like $200 billion of semiconductor subsidies a year. We're talking about $50 billion in the US over like 6, right? So the girth or difference in, like, the subsidy amounts is also huge, right? And so I think Trump has been talking about tariffing Taiwan recently. That's sort of like one of these things that's like, oh, okay, well, like, maybe he doesn't want to subsidize the semiconductor industry. Obviously, tariffing Taiwan is going to cost a lot of things to go get much more expensive, but does it change the equation for TSMC building more fabs in the US? That's what he's sort of positing, right?
So can you lay out we laid out the importance. By the way, it's incredible how much you know about so much.
We told you Dylan knows all this stuff.
Yeah. So, okay, you laid out why TSMC is really important. If we look out into the future, 10, 20 years out, US-China relationship seems like it can go to a dark place of Cold War, escalated Cold War, or even hot war, or to a good place of anything from frenemies to cooperation to working together. So in this game theory, complicated game, what are the different trajectories? What should U.S. be doing? Like, what do you see as the different possible trajectories of U.S.-China relations as both leaders start to feel the AGI more and more and see the importance of chips and the importance of AI?
I mean, ultimately, the export controls are pointing towards a separate future economy. I think the U.S. has made it clear to Chinese leaders that we intend to control this technology at whatever cost to global economic integration.
So
that it's hard to unwind that. Like the card has been played.
To the same extent, they've also limited U.S. companies from entering China, right? So it is. It's been a long time coming. At some point, there was a convergence, right? But over at least the last decade, it's been branching further and further out, right? Like, U.S. companies can't enter China, Chinese companies can't enter the U.S. The U.S. is saying, hey, China, you can't get access to our technologies in certain areas, and China's rebuttaling with the same thing around, like, they've done some sort of specific materials in, gallium and things like that they've tried to limit the US on. There's a US drone company that's not allowed to buy batteries, and they have, like, military customers, and this drone company just tells the military customers, like, hey, just get it from Amazon because I can't actually physically get them, right? Like, there's all these things that are happening that point to further and further divergence. I have zero idea, and I would love if we could all hold hands and sing Kumbaya, but, like, I have zero idea how that could possibly happen.
Is the divergence good or bad for avoiding war? Is it possible that the divergence in terms of manufacture of chips, of training AI systems, is actually good for
It's
avoiding military
It's an
conflict.
objective fact that the world has been the most peaceful it's ever been when there are global hegemons, right? Or regional hegemons, right? In historical context, right? The Mediterranean was the most peaceful ever when the Romans were there, right? China had very peaceful and warring times, and the peaceful times were when dynasties had a lockhold over not just themselves, but all their tributaries around them, right? And likewise, the most peaceful time in human history has been when the U.S. was the global hegemon, right? The last decades. Now we've sort of seen things start to slide, right, with Russia, Ukraine, with what's going on in the Middle East, and Taiwan risk. All these different things are starting to bubble up. Still, objectively, extremely peaceful. Now, what happens when it's not one global hegemon, but it's two? Obviously, and China will be competitive or even overtake the U.S. like it's possible, right? And so this change in global hegemony. It's I don't think it ever happens like super peacefully, right? When empires fall, right, which is a possible trajectory for America, they don't fall gracefully, right? Like they don't just slide out of irrelevance. Usually there's a lot of shaking. And so, what the US is trying to do is maintain its top position, and what China is trying to do is become the top position, right? And obviously there's butting of heads here. In the most simple terms.
And that could take shape in all kinds of ways, including proxy wars.
Yeah,
And
it
that
seems like it's already happening. Like, as much as I want there to be centuries of prolonged peace, it does not. It looks like further instability internationally is ahead.
And the US's like sort of like current task is like, hey, if we control AI, if we're the leader in AI, then and AI significantly accelerates progress, then we can maintain the global hegemony position, and therefore
I hope that works.
and as an American, like, kind of like, okay, I guess that's going to lead to peace for us. Now, obviously, other people around the world get affected negatively. Obviously, the Chinese people are not going to be in as advantageous of a position if that happens. But this is sort of the reality of like what's being done and the actions that are being carried out.